Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along to hear about the work that myself and others have been doing in southwest of Britain, kind of mainly looking at the initial phases of the Roman conquest and the subsequent sort of century or so. I would like to begin by saying I apologise that I couldn't make the October talk date, but I think we're all suffering with various illnesses, so it's no surprise that matters change, but I'm glad to be here this evening. First of all, I would like to also say that the work that I present is very much collaborative. Particularly so with my colleague at the University of Exeter, João Fonte, a Portuguese researcher whose expertise lay in remote sensing and actually Iberian Roman archaeology, but he and I have teamed up, have been collaborating for the past few years in the southwest. As I go through, and if there's anybody else that I feel that deserves specific mention, I shall, and that will particularly be the case when I come to talk about some of the potential Roman road network. I should also just like to sort of mark the opening slide by saying this was an image from Paul Bidwell's 1980 volume on Exeter, so Isca. And tonight I'm going to be talking about how our understanding of what is going on beyond Isca, further west, and also perhaps a little bit to the north, has changed since Paul's initial work. But Paul, up until the very end, was actually at the forefront of revisiting and reinterpreting the Roman military period, in particular in the southwest Britain. And so I think his legacy will continue for some years yet. My work on Roman archaeology in the southwest Britain started in 2006 and 2007 with the fortuitous discovery of a permanent auxiliary fort at a village called Calstock on the Cornish bank of the River Tamar, so central to the southwest peninsula. That was found during a research project looking at medieval silver mining. And as a late 20s researcher, it really caught me that there are these sites such as this that were still previously unknown and there to be discovered. And so since that date, despite what grant work I've been undertaking, I've always pursued my interest in the Roman military period and the conquest phases in the southwest. Various excavations, largely driven by community involvement, through the early part of the 2010s, and myself and a colleague at Exeter, Professor Stephen Rippon, was successful in 2017 in gaining a significant lottery grant to run a 4-year public participation project, combining his work and another colleague's work at a Roman settlement at Ipplepen near Newton Abbot, but also with my work at Calstock in the Tamar Valley. And we were quite successfully running along with that project, running large excavations, extensive surveys, geophysics, topographic survey, when the pandemic hit. And we're roughly halfway through. And it became apparent that we weren't going to be able to run any more in-person events. We just started running our winter program of desk-based or indoor workshops, and we had trialed the use of LiDAR data with small teams of individuals in a tutored environment in village halls, and that was going well until we were forced to stop. And my initial reaction, other than feeling like everybody else completely overwhelmed with the news of a pandemic, was to actually wonder whether we could transfer some of our volunteering and our public participation over to remote volunteering using the digital resources that we'd already established. So during the winter of 2020 into the spring of 2021, I led a small group of volunteers who I'd been able to offer in-person training to remotely access the data, process LiDAR data, and begin to map archaeological earthwork sites that were unrecorded either on the Devon or Cornwall historic environment records. We initially trialled this in the Tamar Valley simply because it was the area around Calstock and also where I live. And it soon became apparent that we could expand upon that. 2 residents in Cornwall, John, Fran, the main images here, actually over that sort of 4-5 month period, systematically mapped about 80% of the area of Cornwall using LiDAR data we provided them, and discovered, I think, 135 new earthwork sites, predominantly of a type of enclosed late prehistoric, early historic, so Iron Age or Roman enclosed settlement sites. And as I say, they mapped about 100, I think 135 of those over that initial first COVID winter. Other volunteers worked sort of on the Devon side of the Tamar Valley with similar successes, but didn't achieve the coverage that John and Fran had in Cornwall. They basically became a research team, and the three of us worked closely together. And it was really inspiring to see what could be achieved using public power, citizen science. I then ran a series of excavations post the worst of the pandemic back at Calstock. And just as the end of that excavation took place in August of last year, I had a bulletin from the Heritage Fund saying that they were interested in looking for projects that involved digital remote volunteering in heritage. And it struck me that this was the ideal opportunity to expand upon that pilot work that we'd undertaken during the first year or so of the COVID crisis. So I applied for a grant to run a year-long project with the aim of systematically mapping every single parish in Devon and Cornwall using the now total coverage of national LiDAR programme data collected by the Environment Agency and made available via the DEFRA data portal. So that project, which is largely what I shall sort of report the findings of this evening, started last January and is due to come to an end in February this year. We have about 6 weeks left of that grant. So that's been very much driven by the pilot work done during the first phase of the pandemic, but this is now directly in collaboration with my colleague João Font, who is the data manager for this project. So I'm very much public facing, training, logging, and João is very much managing our data. So the map on this screen is essentially a modern civil parishes across the counties of Devon and Cornwall, every county infilled with green or pink, as either green has been recorded, systematically mapped, or pink is ongoing. The white ones have yet to be allocated to volunteers, and we're running with a team of 56 volunteers, a bit like yourselves this evening, spread from all parts of the UK, but also overseas as well. And in fact, I have one volunteer who works away whilst doing marine survey off the shores of Vietnam. So we're almost, we've almost finished. I think we will achieve total coverage as we intended and as we set out to do. And this will have, I think, probably resulted in the logging. It's currently about 580 new archaeological sites. So I suspect we'll be getting up to sort of 600-700 but by the time the work is complete. Of course, whilst I'm speaking about the Roman period in particular this evening, our scrutiny, our mapping of the LiDAR data enables us to map archaeological sites and monuments of all periods. We have not followed Historic England's archaeological investigation and mapping sort of agenda. We've excluded lots of remnant field boundaries, things that have been lost from the historic landscape, not particularly focused on mapping individual quarries or extractive pits unless we can understand the context for them. So we've very much been mapping the more sort of significant archaeological sites that have previously unmapped. But that does include medieval, post-medieval industrial landscapes, for example. Here, just outside Tavistock, tin extraction of a scale that's previously unrecorded, undated, in some parts predates the medieval landscape, so is possibly early medieval onwards, could be pre-medieval. Through to the very recent 17th, 18th century lime kilns in the lower part of the Tor Valley. Only one of these lime kilns was known and recorded in the Historic Environment Record, and our volunteer noticed that there were in fact a line of fives cut into the scarp above the river. Equally, the southwest is littered with the remains of deserted medieval settlements and their associated field patterns. Here, an example from Bratton Fleming. On the southwest side of Exmoor, a very significant holloway with platforms either side associated with a strip field system, able to link this to a documentary record from the 14th century, but all previously unknown and unrecorded. But the main purpose of speaking tonight is to talk to you about how our work has impacted upon our understanding of the Roman period, and realistically the initial phases of the Roman period, so the 1st to 2nd centuries across the southwest counties. Our understanding has really developed greatly in the past 40 years. The bottom left map here is from Paul Bidwell's Roman Exeter volume, and really only highlights Exeter, which is known, the military complex at North Taunton, recently discovered at this date, fort at Nanstallen, and the signal stations on the North Cornwall and North Devon, West Somerset coast. It very much shows how the road network appears to peter out, and frankly, that not a great deal understood. Leap forward to 2021 with publication of my colleagues Steve and Neil Holbrook's volumes, which were framing Exeter in its region. So it's Exeter, a place in time was the project. And we can see that the map is now very much more populated with an additional 2 certain auxiliary forts in Cornwall, Restormal, and the site where I work at Calstock, discovered within, I think, a year of each other. The fort at Oakmont, North Taunton, Lapford, Bury, Barton. But we get a picture that there's more happening in the southwest than we realised only 40 years ago, particularly in the Exe and Culm valleys and on the southwest side of the Blackdown Hills. In terms of the Roman roads known to come into the southwest, essentially we sit at the end of the Fossway, and then the branch road, Margaret 4F, coming in towards Isca, towards Exeter, from Axminster and via Honiton. I think at this point, 491 heading down towards the River Tean from Exeter had been ground truthed, and there are some records of observations of earthworks that are held within the Historic Environment Record, and also the recognition of 492 heading towards the complex at North Taunton, but no certain route between North Taunton and Exeter as in a complete route. Should point out that at this point, all other roads suggested in the southwest, 493, and the route going down the spine of the peninsula towards Cornwall were speculative and based on alignments of ridge roads. Steve and colleagues working on the Exeter Place in Time project produced two illustrations which really show the degree of uncertainty. And I know that this subject has come up before in previous talks for the association. I think Mike spoke about this previously, how archaeological maps often have Roman roads on them, or maps published for archaeological purposes, but the evidence basis for those is often weak. And various projects, the Ordnance Survey map of Roman Britain, probably the truest out of all of these in terms of the physical evidence. Margary's with speculative routes going west of North Taunton down the spine of the peninsula and up towards Barnstaple. And then again, the Roman rural settlement projects mapping, kind of combining the known and the speculative. David, Gould and Steve came up with a final version of a map which proposes those roads which Margery had suggested, with which basis there was some physical evidence. So that's kind of where we are at in terms of the road network up until about 2020. The work of John Salvatore, Steve Kay, Steve Stocker, and the late Hugh Toller has really been a driving force for understanding the morphology and the field evidence for what a Roman road may look like across the southwest. And much like anywhere else, it takes the form of an agger, often with quarry pits, roadside ditches, or indeed terraces down slopes and cuttings where slopes are particularly steep. And this is a section of the Roman road between North Taunton and Exeter, as shown on LiDAR data, and you can see parts of an agger, faint traces of quarry pits and roadside ditches, but also a terrace cut as it moves down the slope. But essentially, John, Steve et al. Were able to basically propose the full course of the road just northwest of Exeter across to North Taunton, and then on to Oakhampton. And we have roads going north of Exeter up the Colne Valley, Exeter and Colne Valley. This is the Colne Valley towards the North Somerset coast or the Northwest Somerset coast at Watchet, Porlock area. The build-up of the roads, and as seen elsewhere, I looked at some examples from Wales. They are rather insubstantial in construction. A bedding layer of coarse local geology with one or two subsequent metalling layers. They generally, across the southwest, show themselves to be between 7 and 12 meters across, suggesting that there's a degree of variation in their construction. So I'll start with the end product of where we're currently at. And all of the lines shown in red on here are segments of road or segments of earthwork that have been observed on LiDAR data that have the hallmarks of the Roman road. This has been variously mapped by John Salvatore, Steve Kay, Hugh Toller, particularly notable from the Exeter to North Taunton road here. Steve Kay in particular, I think, has mapped much of this north-south road going from Exeter towards the northwest Somerset coast. Coincidentally, Mike actually and I observed the length of road here in Cornwall at roughly the same time, and one length of road which I haven't marked on here running, well, actually it runs from Oakhampton down towards Tavistock. I think Steve Kay and I reported to the Historic Environment Record within 2 days of each other. So what I really want to get across here is that the map that we've now got is very much a joint venture, a collaborative product. And I think the fact that we've been able to independently verify anomalies and propose them as the same without direct collaboration really does help make the case that this is a coherent road network, one of which has a uniform morphology in terms of archaeological earthworks, and actually, as you can see from this map, presents a logical road network in itself. I'm going to just have a look at a few examples of the morphology of the road in different parts of the southwest, so you can gain an idea of how consistent it is in its appearance. This is one of the earlier segments, or the first segments that I was able to map during our pilot work, and essentially runs from just west of Bridgewater on the west side of the River Parrett and heads across the Quantocks and ultimately towards the eastern side of Exmoor. You can make out that I hope you can make out that it's got a negative earthwork, meaning it's a terrace cut into the ground, but you can see how it cuts straight across this landscape, straight across the terrain, and is overlain by the historic landscape. And there is little doubt about what this is. The key to this road and understanding its purpose, I think, comes to with the point that it actually heads directly towards the River Parrett and the Parrett estuary. So the eastern end of the road, as seen as a LiDAR earthwork, gets us just outside of Bridgewater. And we know the River Parrett seems to have been an important transshipment river, an estuary for moving goods, probably from the Exe Valley up into the Severn estuary, but also probably from materials from southwest Somerset and West Dorset. two well-known ports, one at Cumich and one at Crandon Bridge. Crandon Bridge was affected by the development of the M5, and when the material derived from the M5 excavations was written up, it basically gives the indication of a bustling, busy port moving goods and materials from the 2nd through to the 4th centuries. I don't think there's any secure evidence of 1st century activity based on the excavations that took place. But I'd suggest that based on the floodplains and the river movement itself, that our road that heads west from this area is actually connecting a port, probably somewhere in Bridgewater. And the fact is there's another port, not just Cumich and Crandon Bridge, but we have another riverside settlement somewhere underneath historic Bridgewater. Where this goes in the other direction, it seems to head towards the iron producing districts on the east side of Exmoor, Clatworthy, etc. So I think this road is potentially connecting some mineral bearing districts directly with the transshipment ports. It seems to head directly towards those mineral resources. If it was simply wanting to head down the spine of the peninsula, I would expect it to take a slightly different route. So I think this could be directly connecting some of the iron-bearing districts with the riverine and then coastal communication network. Moving to the sort of southwest across the county border between Somerset and Devon into mid-Devon, this is the latest release of LiDAR data that came out during, I think, June or July this year. And on that, I was able to trace some of the hallmark signatures of linear arrangements of quarry pits associated with an upstanding agar, faint in places, but bearing in mind that much of this landscape in central Devon has been ploughed historically, and more of it is currently being ploughed. So although faint, we can see the hallmarks of the agar with quarry pits alongside it. And interestingly, I think we also have here a branch that runs to the southwest and kinks, and you can see hopefully make out agar and quarry pits, particularly in this area across here. And what this suggests is that we've got a junction, a branch heading down towards Isca, down towards Exeter, and then a continuation heading and probably linking in with the road network around North Taunton. So I think we can be looking at nodal places. The road network, as we're seeing it, is suggesting there are nodal places. Is there somewhere significant at this road junction that we have yet to learn anything about archaeologically? We can't see anything on LiDAR data, and there is no other sort of archaeological information. But one might think that at significant road junctions, there may be important nodal settlements. West of Oakhampton, so this is where John Salvatore, Steve Kay, Steve Stocker and Hugh Toller had got the road as far as just east of Oakhampton, and a section excavated outside the fort at Oakhampton. But my first thoughts here are that the crossing of the river Oakmont must be around the fort, because the road that we find heading further west seems to be moving up towards the west side of Oakhampton rather than to the south side of it. So I think the road network is really skirting around the lowest slopes of the north side of Dartmoor. This is Dartmoor here. Margery suggested, based on historic ridge roads and some place name evidence, Portgate is one of the names, Old Street Down, that this historic routeway here was likely to be the route of the Roman road network as it went further west into Cornwall. And we do have LiDAR evidence for earthworks that kind of corroborate that. One thing to note about the overall distribution of roads is that many of the gaps within the network that we've mapped are actually filled in by historic routes. So I think there is a degree of fossilization inherent within the network. And then there is again another junction with the road heading down towards the lower reaches of the River Tamar via Brentor and just north of Tavistock. So that road that Margery suggested running west of Oakhampton, the Central Archaeological Unit, and then the Exeter Museum's Field Unit, over a space of 5 or 6 years, excavated a segment of Roman road at Sowerton. Posited as Roman simply because it was sealed by, I think, 2 buried soils, and had all the hallmarks in terms of construction of a Roman road. But as is the case with, I think, each intervention that we've seen, excavation of a possible Roman road in the southwest, no direct dating evidence. So that is one thing to bear in mind. But had the field unit or the Central Archaeological Unit at the time had the benefit of LiDAR, they would have probably been able to project and look at some of the earthworks that we see heading further southwest. So these earthworks here, roadside ditches, representing a continuation of the road that was excavated. These 2 arrows here present something of a common theme, which is routes through landscapes seem to have resulted in multiple earthworks, and it could suggest a long chronology, much longer than the Roman period. A convenient topographic or a logical topographic route may have been used in prehistory, but also beyond the Roman period, before the formalization of the medieval road network. So some of these earthworks that seem to follow the same route could well be of an earlier or indeed later phase, just to make that point. Fairly confident, however, as we move further west along Margery's road heading towards the River Tamar around Lifton, is that there are a pair of linear ditches that are spaced about 10 meters apart, having the hallmarks of the road as we've seen elsewhere, but I think significantly is fronted onto by a sub-rectangular enclosure, which is clearly respecting that route. And we'd assume that an enclosure like this would be of either late Iron Age, but more probably of Roman date. So I think the fact that you've got earthwork enclosures respecting these the earthworks of what we would propose to be a route is significant. The latest technique that I think is going to have a lot of use in our understanding of the road network is OSL dating. I have made the point already that we have difficulty in dating roads or former trackways when there's no physical material, there's no ceramics, a lack of carbonized material for radiocarbon dating. So I think the use of OSL dating, which enables you to date the time at which a deposit was last exposed to sunlight. So if you then have something that seals it, the construction of a road over a surface, over a buried soil, it gives you an indication quite accurately of when that was last exposed, and therefore a date for the construction of an earthwork. I recently visited an excavation outside Plymouth at the new community or new town at Sherford. So Plymouth is here, and this new community is just off the A38. The red lines you can see on this Ordnance Survey base map are where we have identified archaeological earthworks on LiDAR data that bear the hallmarks of being like a Roman road. And we can see we have the suggestion of a network or part of the network that comes around the south side of Dartmoor and will then have swung up via the Dart and the Tean valleys. The nature of that earthwork at the northernmost point, just to the southeast of Tavistock, there's a clear earthwork embankment, and it's very visible on the ground, but flanked by quarry pits. And whilst this road survives, or this earthwork survives very well, and is quite surprising as such, it is because it is on open common land. The quarry pits themselves are still very visible, and they infill with water, to the point that you might think actually these must be relatively recent. However, we do have outside of Plymouth some well-dated earthworks, which we can also trace on the LiDAR. So, for example, the earthwork here is the Plymouth Leat. It brought water from southwest Dartmoor into the town of Plymouth, and that's dated 1585. So whatever this earthwork is, it clearly predates the 16th century. And I think you have to bear in mind that if it has the physical hallmarks, is the right dimensions, and seems to fit within a logical network, then we shouldn't be looking for a reason to argue it away. It's clearly not of a recent origin. Another point factor is when you integrate data such as the portable antiquities scheme, so often coin finds, object finds, the gap in the network of LiDAR anomalies here. I happened to check the portable antiquities scheme database, and there's a cluster of detected Roman coins, 1st to 2nd century date, right in this gap. So again, I think corroborative evidence. The final piece of evidence that I think works is that the excavations at Sherford undertaken by AC Archaeology over the past year have revealed a significant length of undated but well-made road surface with wheel ruts, predating the historic landscape. It runs beneath the historic field pattern. It has roadside ditches and also quarry pits alongside it. And we are currently awaiting OSL dates for that, hopefully in the next month or so. But it does appear, and the topography would suggest that actually if this road that we're mapping on the west side of Dartmoor continued, it would head exactly in this direction. So I think this may be our first well-dated section of road that seems to link in with the network that we're proposing. If we go into the Foy estuary, or the River Foy in mid-Cornwall, that's this river here, the auxiliary fort, small auxiliary fort at Restormal, is shown as a beautiful square earthwork with annexes to the west, medieval castle Restormal, equally showing as a lovely earthwork. During the first phases of the volunteer project, I was scanning in the area of known Roman sites to see whether we may find evidence easily for other military sites or indeed of the road network. And I was drawn instantly to a line of quarry pits that run along what's known as the Tap House Ridge, and also accompanied by an Agar, the upstanding road. I then found out that Mike had also seen this, but again, independent corroboration of something by people looking for these anomalies makes me think that we're not far off the beaten track, so to speak, and this must be a Roman road, and it fills our network and heads over towards the Tamar, where we have other good evidence. We just need to find the bits in between. On the north side of Bodmin, again, an Agar crossing through open countryside, unenclosed land. Up here, quarry pits and Agar. The bright spot here is a barrow on top of a prominent hill. So the road builders have actually skirted around the hill, and that's why it's not a dead straight, but in fact rounds around. But again, all the hallmarks there of the construction methods that we'd expect with it being a Roman road. And importantly, as we move towards Davidstow, the earthworks sit beneath and are obscured by the medieval open field. So they're giving us a pre-medieval date for this earthwork. Lastly, and yet to be reported upon, improvements of the A30 in the single carriageway section between Chiverton and Carling Cross, further west in Cornwall. I'm reliably told by Sean Taylor, who's the Cornwall Archaeological Unit archaeologist who's overseen all of the work, that there are multiple undated roads that have come up during those excavations. Again, awaiting OSL dating, but he suspects, as I do, that some of these will turn out to be part of this Roman network heading further west down towards the far west of Cornwall. So we await those dates and more information on that quite eagerly. The one area to note, just as a comment really, is that there doesn't appear to be much evidence heading from mid-Devon up towards North Devon, the Barnstable, Bude areas, and we've searched intensively in that area, as have others, Steve Kay in particular. We had a conversation about this, and there's still yet to be anything convincing as an earthwork connecting us with the mouth of the Tor and the Torridge. In terms of chronology, I've alluded to the fact that there is no secure dating evidence for any of these segments of road. There's some relative dating in terms of the stratigraphy of where they sit within the landscape beneath medieval features. There's no ceramic dating, there's no radiocarbon dating, except where roads have fallen within or adjacent to excavated Roman sites. So, for example, at Calstock, we have a road exiting the West Gate, but that's not a road crossing open country as these roads we're talking about here are. So we have the issue of poor dating. Say OSL will help. One suspects that the military must have had a hand in the construction of these roads, and indeed the military sites in the region sit in proximity to the road network, but in most instances actually would appear to be off of branch roads. So they're not sat directly upon the network as we're seeing it here. They actually are linked to it by their own connections. Two sites that I wanted just to have a quick look at in mid-Devon, which might help us think about the length of use of these roads, and indeed perhaps their primary purpose beyond the military phase, of a site called Bury, Barton and North Taunton, both of which have a military presence, but also I'll go on to suggest something slightly different as well. So North Taunton has been known for 60 years or so, visible on RAF aerial photographs, an earthwork here scheduled as an auxiliary fort with an annex to the west side next to the river, sitting adjacent to the east-west road running from Exeter to the River Tor and crossing and heading towards, now we know, heading down towards Oakmont. Cropmarks mapped variously by Welfare and Swan, Francis Griffith, the former county archaeologist for Devon, suggesting a large complex and a complex too. Certainly at least one legionary scale marching camp, but as Francis proposed, a vexillation fortress, I think it was her proposal, as well. So permanent auxiliary fort, seasonal fortress, and then one, if not more, legionary marching camps. So we're perhaps looking at the phases of movement of the Second Augustan Legion through this landscape, ultimately ending in a permanent auxiliary fort. Just after 2010, so this was in a few years after I'd done some large-scale excavations at Calstock, I was contacted by a Warwickshire-based archaeologist, Bryn Gethin, and the late Hugh Toller about North Taunton, and we were variously looking at this site at the same time using LiDAR data. But the image in the bottom right best sums up the initial interpretations proposed by Bryn and Hugh, which at the time I think, and I still do, had significant credence. The earthwork fort, they might later fort, but they'd noticed that there seemed to be a much larger set of earthworks enclosing an area of around 28 hectares. That's a significant area. I think it's 650 by 450 meters. Bryn's suggestion that a historic feature, or something that's mapped historically as Debaith Pool, might be an amphitheatre outside this large earthwork enclosure. Some excellent suggestions. And as we've been able to do more work here, particularly I think between 2018 and just before the start of the pandemic, João and I led a team of volunteers and students in surveying about 35 hectares of the North Taunton complex using magnetometry with some targeted resistivity, and actually mapped a large part of the complex. And the results are quite surprising in that the enclosure suggested by Bryn and Hugh actually manifests itself as a magnetic anomaly as well, and we do appear to have a coherent enclosure of about 28 hectares, centered on the east-west road that goes from Exeter to this complex and then on to Oakhampton. The road itself is exactly to within a metre halfway between the north and south side of the earthwork enclosure suggested by Bryn and Hugh, which again makes me think that it's there's no question of its validity as an archaeological site. We are looking at it as a single complex. The magnetic survey has probably revealed that what is scheduled as an auxiliary fort is nothing like that. In fact, both in the LiDAR data earthworks, we can see that the earthworks that are scheduled, if we just think principally of this playing card shape, actually there are extensions to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. Magnetically, we see exactly the same. They're the earthworks that stand today and are scheduled are the fortuitous survival, or the selective survival of something that was greater in extent. There are no suggestions of banks of ovens within the ramparts, and the construction method itself means that the two ditches which you would propose to be surrounding a fort are actually either side of the earthwork. They appear to be nothing more than small flanking ditches either side of an upcast bank. I'll have a look at the north side in more detail, because this is where I think the picture really changes. So we're looking at an area of around 230 meters between the northern part of this enclosure and the center line of the east-west main road from Exeter. We have a north-south branch road that comes down to a T-junction here, which we picked up during magnetic survey, and this field was ploughed at the time, and we picked up building material. We observed building material, roof tile, box flue tile, imbrex, tegular, different ceramics from Samian through to coursewares, amphora, mortaria, all the way north and south, as well as worn road stone. The magnetic survey allows us to suggest that all of the areas of high intensity and magnetic noise probably correspond to buildings that front onto these internal streets, of which there are east-west branch roads. And also the blanks in the data tell us that there are also likely to be roads running north-south parallel with this principal road here. Parch marks, and I don't know if you'll be able to make this out, visible on the last edition of Google Earth Imagery, coincide with the areas of magnetic noise, suggesting that where we see magnetic noise on this plot, we are looking at roadside buildings fronting onto these wide thoroughfares, and the roads themselves are about 15 meters across. A Cropmark mapped by Francis Griffith here coincides with high intensity magnetic anomalies, and it was suggested by Francis that this may be a bathhouse. The picture that I'm trying to give you is that we have a very large enclosed site with an internal gridded road network with north, south, east, west components with high intensity occupation fronting onto them, with parch marks indicative of masonry and all of the building materials suggestive of something high status. Now, this does not accord with being a military site. I think whatever this evolves from, whether the military presence is the foundation element to this, I think ultimately becomes something more of an urban character. I was able to run some excavations early last year, which were just outside of the scheduled area, which now just to characterize some of this activity. We looked at the earthworks associated with the continuations of what was always proposed to be an auxiliary fort, and the ditches flanking the earthworks are actually very slight, not military in form at all, undated I should add. But some of the roadside activity is of an industrial nature, and we had back-to-back iron smelting furnaces. The key thing here is that the military period in the southwest is believed to end within the 80s, but the ceramics from the excavation in this trench run from 90 through to at least 120. So we have post-military occupation, and I propose that North Taunton, whether it originates as a military complex, essentially becomes, to use the word kind of quite carefully, I think it becomes a town. And that would also help explain the presence of an amphitheatre outside of the North Gate. The amphitheatre, I should add, that Bryn suggests is exactly the same dimensions as that at Richborough. A permanent auxiliary fort at Bury Barton, Lapford, so just to the north east of North Taunton, excavated by Malcolm Todd, former professor of archaeology at Exeter in the mid-80s, confirmed second half of the first century date for a playing card auxiliary fort. And that has stayed within the literature and is accepted and appears on all distribution maps. The thing that isn't really discussed properly, and I think because it was quite poorly understood in terms of its extent, is an enclosure that Malcolm had noticed as an earthwork that surrounded it, the outer earthwork. LiDAR data enables us to give a much fuller extent to that. And it actually covers about 11 hectares with a suggestion of a second line of defence, certainly on the south side. The key thing here is that Malcolm's excavations gave a 3rd to 4th century date for the establishment of this earthwork, and the lowest fills, or at least it was still open in the 3rd, 4th century, the lowest fills of the ditch on this enclosure on the west side had 3rd to 4th century material in it. And excavations within the fort's footprint itself identified undated structures that didn't fall on the alignment of the fort, plus others which contained solely 4th century material within them. Again, bearing in mind its position on the road network, which I showed earlier, I suggest that we may be looking at the retention of an important place of Roman military origin, but becomes a later defended small town of a type that sits comfortably in the mid to lower ranges of those in Burnham and Watier's small towns of Roman Britain. So think of anything from the scale of Mildenhall downwards, and this is the scale of this enclosure. So those two sites I've just slipped in to make the point that I think we have we will start to understand more about the non-military character of central places and nodal points within the southwest, including previously unrecognized urban sites or significant defended roadside settlements. So if we looked at the map of Roman small towns, with the road network as known in the early 90s, add our roads on and those two sites, I think you'd be hard pushed to get away from the fact that actually the southwest starts to look very much like most other parts of lowland southern Britain, where you have a network of roads with significant stations, towns, mansio along their course. And I think we will see this picture develop in years to come. In terms of going sort of back to the military and the campaigning phase, Bury Barton, I'm not sure why it appears on this map of the initial activity of the Second Augusta as they push west. The Claudian coins there as the black symbols, something that Sam Moorhead from the British Museum has been keen to pursue, is the idea that the Claudian coins appearing in the southwest represent a very early phase of campaigning, probably coastal. A number of marching camps known, Alverdiscott, North Taunton, the Legionary camp that I showed you, but also excavations undertaken by AC Archaeology at Twin Yeo near Chudley revealed a segment of marching camp, although we can't ascertain the scale of it because only part of it was excavated. Leaping forward with more recent observations, we can add another 2 auxiliary scale marching camps. One at Calstock sits beneath the fort, the initial incursions, and the same at Restormal. They're the 2 blue stars. The 3 red stars are legionary scale marching camps which have been identified one after the other year on year over the past 3 years. I'm going to skip these 2 slides, I think. I don't add a lot to it, given the time we have. So 2019, a commercial excavation at Roach to South St Austell, a road scheme, identified what was thought to be the western side of probably an auxiliary scale marching camp. Subsequent work beyond the excavation to test the scale using geophysics has actually shown that this is a just over 11 hectare legionary marching camp, and puts us about 50 miles further west for the whole legion than it was currently known. So for many years, North Taunton was the furthest west that we could actually place the legion, but the one discovery has pushed the legion a further 50 miles further west. And the implications for that are quite profound in terms of when was the Legion campaigning this far west in its entirety. October 2020, some ungodly hour trying to distract myself from the pandemic, looking in the vicinity of Restormal in the Foy Valley. Myself and colleague Joao were sharing data, looking at it, and we came across an earthwork in dense woodland on the National Trust's Land Hydrock estate. All the hallmarks physically of a playing card shaped marching camp, rounded corners, straight sides. The key thing with this site is that it survives very well in woodland, because we know from a a historic atlas of Lanhydrock that this land went from rough scrub moor and was planted as woodland. So it's never been cultivated, which seems to give us a good basis for the foundation, for the preservation of this earthwork. And having visited the site twice now with the National Trust archaeologist Jim Parry, we're in agreement that there's a strong likelihood that this is a very well preserved, in fact, exceptionally well preserved legionary marching camp at a strategic crossing point of the River Foy. So this is very close to where Mike and I had observed the road network, and not far upstream from what becomes the permanent base at Restormal. And then last year, I was looking to see if I could use proxy data from the PAS, distributions of where objects, coins have been found, and I started to sort of pull apart the data and look at objects that were Republican, so may have come in as an early object with a campaigning army, those that were first century versus those which were the overall Roman, general Roman in date. And so the yellow and red here represent those objects which would surely represent a military presence or the earliest presence. And I was actually looking at Cropmark data using Google Earth and focused on an area further down the Tor Valley, and came across a Cropmark with rounded corners, using the benefit of the different time slices in Google Earth, was able to map about 3/4 of the circuit of a complete circuit of a marching camp sat above the confluence of the rivers Yeo and Tor, about 10 miles downstream of North Taunton. So good, well-dated evidence, first century material coming up in the area where there's a sound Cropmark. And so to date, this is the largest marching camp we have in the southwest. But those 3 sites now seem to suggest that the army are pushing north and west beyond Isca. But given the fact that in both instances the camps are relatively close to each other, both in the Tor Valley and further west near the River Foy, suggests that we're not looking at a single campaigning phase, but maybe looking at returning, coming and going, the legion moving in and out of an area at different points in time. In terms of the later occupation, what's new? We have 2 new permanent auxiliary forts beyond those Restormal and Cowstock. Bryn Gethin had observed an earthwork above the River Tor. It's almost at its tidal limit at Bishop's Taunton, at a place called Herner. 2 square earthworks, which on later data appear more clearly, sat on a very prominent hilltop. We managed to undertake a single day's worth of survey, Joao Irons and volunteers, and it confirms the permanent nature of this as a military site at the lowest reaches of the Tor. Importantly, it shows that either 2 phases or something very unusual in terms of the construction means of this site. But again, large buildings sat outside of the formal defences, and it appears to be a common theme that we have additional defensive lines beyond the limits of our auxiliary forts that you would argue are not annexes. They are enclosing activity, enclosing buildings outside of the fort. And to think of the context of that, one might wonder why we need to rapidly enclose extramural activity. At Exbourne, again, I think this is the River Oakmont, so similar Tor, River Oakmont, not far away. There's an earthwork that's been debated backwards and forwards amongst archaeologists that work down here. What is this earthwork? It's a field with massive upstanding earthwork banks, but it has a very unusual character. There's nothing quite like it, and it does appear to be very, very similar in form to Whitley Castle up in Cumbria. And I think there's a strong likelihood that we have an auxiliary fort that is adopting a shape based on the topography here. And the thing to note that the LiDAR shows particularly well is that actually there is an outer enclosing earthwork with an entrance here that seems to accord with what I've just described is that at some point in time, outer enclosures appearing around our auxiliary forts. And we have exactly the same thing here at Calstock, where we have a military period enclosure being thrown up around the fort. And I start to wonder, and John Salvatore has made suggestions in Exeter that during the Boudicca revolt, there's actually some instability and threat levels that saw some additional fortifications outside the fortress at Exeter. And I'm wondering whether we're seeing a reaction at some of our permanently occupied auxiliary forts of that period, where all of the extramural activity is suddenly enclosed by a further defensive circuits. One other type of site that has come up, and I won't talk a great deal about this, through our LiDAR mapping, are small, almost perfectly square enclosures with neat rounded corners. On the continent, you'd be looking at calling these burgi. They have all the hallmarks of a military site, but aren't formally recognized as such. And we see them across all of the area that we've looked in Devon and Cornwall, and into West Somerset, where Steve Kay has been mapping them as well. And I think a good working hypothesis is that these could well be a network of fortlets that either control important routeways or have a strategic control over existing places. Two examples here, for example, sit outside and look at entrances into hilltop enclosed sites. This example here at Warbstow in Cornwall actually has a vantage point over the two entrances in and out of that site. So I'm wary of the time, just to make the point that I think there's a category of site that we've not really been able to discuss that are becoming more frequent. We're recognizing them. And I think the hallmarks are that they look like they should have a military function. To confirm that, again, at Roach, where the Legionary camp was discovered in 2019, excavations by the CAU have also recorded one of these small, perfectly square enclosures with rounded corners. Importantly, kind of helping with the suggestion of it being a fortlet, a titulus blocking the entrance. And I think the ceramics here all fall within the 3rd quarter of the 1st century. So we may now have an excavated example of one of these small fortlets. And I think this is to appear on Digging for Britain in I think either the next one or the one after, and they'd found some evidence for the processing of tin, which is a good step forward in our understanding of the role of the military in the Southwest. Just as I come to an end then, just to remark that if we use the proxy data of the PAS, just as one other means of moving forward, we've now mapped, well, we will have mapped the entire of the Southwest using LiDAR data. I don't think we're going to see many more earthworks suddenly appearing. We're going to have the chance findings of commercial archaeology, but if we want to use other data sets that currently exist to try and help us prospect, maybe to look more intently at crop marks on satellite imagery, we should look to the PAS. Note that some of the main PAS clusters here are known military sites: Restormal, Nanstallen, North Taunton, the complex. That's Rashley, Barton, at Eggersford, where I showed you the large camp. In West Cornwall in particular, note the proliferation of Roman material. There's going to be a degree of detector bias in this, where people are detecting, but I think the suggestion that holds true is that there's actually a lot of activity, and early activity, in this area. Two areas I will point out: the Red River running out from the Hale Estuary inland, and also then sort of west of Penzance, are two areas where there are high concentrations of metal detected finds of the right period, but also where there is field evidence for earthworks of possible military character. Lodged within the historic environment record for Cornwall, there's a suggestion that the earthworks here, which seem to be lovely playing card shaped earthworks with ditches, is a auxiliary fort, but has never really been followed up. I think the coincidence with an area of high concentrations of metal detected finds would mean that we should be looking to investigate a site such as this. And lastly, a site identified by a gentleman from Suffolk called John Rayner, who's been working on LiDAR across southern Britain, but also particularly in Cornwall. He had noted, a little bit like the site at Exeter, how this large plain card shape, 4 hectares, stands out. It doesn't fit within the pattern of the historic fields within this part of West Cornwall. And it again occurs within an area of high numbers of metal detected finds. Its playing card shape, its relationship to the historic landscape, I think there's a good chance that this could actually be a Roman site that's been previously unrecognized. So what comes next? Subject to funding, we really need to move forward with confirming the date range for the road network that we're proposing based on LiDAR earthwork anomalies alone, and whether that is combining C14 with OSL, I think is the only real way forward. We need to particularly test the 2 large camps that have been discovered and unexcavated, so that at Restormal and that at Rashley Barton. And I think probably the most important thing in terms of a new type of site for the Southwest is actually to take a sample of the possible fortlets and undertake bespoke LiDAR survey, photogrammetry, geophysics, and then some targeted excavation to try and understand their date of origin and their function. Because I think if we've got an extensive network of fortlets at which the LiDAR data suggests that we do, then it tells us that the military phase in the Southwest is very different to what we thought of it only 5 years ago. So that's it. I think my hour is up. There are my contact details. If anybody wanted to email me or write, please do. But I'm very happy now to answer any questions that people may have.
Well, thanks very much for that, Chris. That was fascinating, and whilst I already knew about half of that, there's a lot that was new to me. So I'm guessing there's an awful lot there that's new to the majority of the audience. And as you just said, our view of the Southwest during particularly the early part of the Roman period has just changed dramatically over the last 5 years. There's no question about that at all. And I suspect it'll continue to do so over the next decade.
Yeah. Yeah.
We do have a few questions come in, but please keep putting your questions into the chat. Our backroom team are sending them through to me. We've got a few. I suspect 1 or 2 of these might have actually already been answered in the chat, but I'll put them through anyway. First one was just asking to explain what OSL stood for. That's optically stimulated luminescence. I think somebody did mention that in the chat, so I'll save you that one, Chris. And then from Penny Jackson, it's not as an easy a question to answer as you might think. What's the difference between a fort and a fortress?
Well, the forts themselves, as we refer to them, auxiliary forts, they're not occupied by legionaries. The fortresses are the permanent bases of the legion. So the legion is traveling with its entourage of auxiliary units, and those will be housed not only around the fortresses, sometimes within, but actually also then primarily out in the landscape beyond the fortress in these permanent auxiliary forts.
I think you mentioned a vexillation fortress at one point.
Yeah, so vexillation fortress is just a term for a seasonal stopover, if you will. So a marching camp, a legionary marching camp will be where the whole legion is, and it's probably relatively short-lived, maybe days, weeks. A vexillation fortress is basically where we would suggest that the legion or our legion is holding up over winter. So it's a sort of seasonal base. But the suggestion at North Taunton as a vexillation fortress, I think now is debunked. I think we can be quite confident in that the character of that site in particular is very different to what we would have thought of it prior to us either having LiDAR evidence or the extensive geophysics and now the trial excavations that we've undertaken.
From Martin Packer, was the Southwest particularly difficult for the Romans to keep under control?
I actually think that as much as it became unfashionable to think of the military period as being one of aggression in the Southwest, I think the sheer number of military sites that we now know of, which are still going to be only a fraction of those that existed, suggests that a bit like Wales, a bit like the northern frontier, there was a real need for a military presence, although it was relatively short-lived as we currently understand it. We're only sort of talking 30 to 40 years, but there is a need for an initial short, sharp shock to control and to sort of, I guess, to take control of either the population or resources within the southwest. I think the idea that we've now starting to get evidence for mineral exploitation, the processing of tin at the little fortlet near St Austell, the connections of the road network going straight from the Parrot to the iron deposits on the east side of Exmoor is important. One thing I didn't mention is at Calstock in October this year, I undertook an excavation for a television program, and we actually have got the first evidence for the extraction on lead silver deposits. So we have well dated Roman deposits filled with processed ore. So and it's all come off of a lead silver load. So we've got really good concrete evidence now in a number of places, I think, for Roman period. So I think the suggestion is that yes, there's a degree of control needed for the population, but it's perhaps also the amount of evidence, the amount of military sites kind of points towards the resources that the empire wanted out of this part of the world. Just something that is related to that in a way, in terms of, was the area difficult to hold? Was it problematic? I talked about the outer enclosures surrounding a number of the auxiliary forts, Calstock, Jacobstow, probably Herner up at Bishop's Taunton. John Salvatore suggested we have at Exeter. There is this classic narrative that the prefect of the Second Augustan didn't answer the call to go and help deal with Boudica, and he's, it's a common thing that he didn't go, was they scared. I wonder whether actually there was a problem in the southwest which we don't have the written evidence for. Why have we got legionary scale marching camps in close proximity to each other? I'm not sure that they're all of the initial campaigning phase. Could it be that the prefect was dealing with issues in his own patch, and the Second Augusta at this period in the 60, 61 was actually not necessarily in Exeter, was out in further north or west from Exeter, dealing with some local issues that we also see reflected in the archaeology surrounding our auxiliary forts. It's just a thought. We need, but I do think there's some mileage in the fact that there's no way that the prefect, he's no coward. He's not just going to ignore it. So I suggest there's another reason.
Yeah, we only have Tacitus's word for that event, don't we? And not altogether reliable. But that's, no. That's the debate for another night. Just a point of interest: the outworks that you were talking about around the auxiliary forts. I've heard another reason altogether. I've been looking at quite a few of those recently because we have a potential one in Northumberland, but there are plenty in Wales. So there are parallels, very similar shape as well, rather irregular form, not like the fort shape itself. Which brings me on to the next question, neatly. I'm surprised we've not actually been asked this before. From Bob, any hypothesis as to why Roman sites always have rounded corners?
Oh, blimey. No, I'm sure there's a line of sight or something like that. Must be from the corner towers. There must be something in it like that. The easiest, the most efficient way to enclose a space is using a circle or an oval with not straight sides. So whether there's a degree of the efficiency, would it also be due to the fact that certainly when you're building out of earth and timber, it would almost be impossible to have perfectly angular corners? There may be something in that.
There's also a weakness on an angular corner. Putting structural engineer's hat on, actually, most people won't be aware. I've trained as an architect, and we did quite a lot of structural engineering, and square corners are inherently weak, no matter what material you're building out. And I suspect that's probably the reason. Smooth corners give any attacking force less leverage on the structure itself, less ways of breaking it down. It's probably just as simple as that, but who knows? Right, moving on. We've got quite a few coming in now. From Penny Jackson again. Right, I'll answer this one if you don't mind, because I was doing this today. she's asking about the DEFRA LiDAR viewer. That's the pre-processed LiDAR that you can actually see access from the DEFRA site. She was just asking if we knew why it had stopped working. I think it might be your browser. Try a different browser, Penny, because I was actually using it this afternoon and it was fine on Chrome. Just try a different browser. From Martin Packer, some of the pictures show post-Roman field boundaries, etc., ignoring Roman sites. Why might that be? I would assume many Roman earthworks would still be substantial in the early post-Roman period.
Again, a good question. They obviously were depleted enough, the earthworks, to not actually be influential in the development of what comes later. So much like earthworks of any period can be overlain by others. I guess they just, in some instances were a nuisance. They may have been deliberately slighted, and so you're left with a denuded earthwork. Certainly, we know that during the sort of post-medieval period that archaeological earthworks, barrows, enclosures were deliberately slighted to improve the ground, but also to take material. So, I don't think there's much in the fact that they ignored it. I don't think there's anything symbolic. They'd obviously just gone out of use and denuded enough to be sort of overlain. Interestingly, however, and I took the slides out because they take quite a lot of discussion around the fringes of Bodmin, South Exmoor, and particularly on the west side of Dartmoor. We've identified fossilized landscapes, so historic landscapes whose framework is clearly based upon late prehistoric, early historic settlements and enclosure systems. One develops from the other, and this is a phenomenon that in West Penwith is now very well known. And you get irregular field systems that are in use today, which actually have got a well-dated sequence of evolution from the Bronze Age through to present day. And that again has been a fairly recent product of OSL dating, showing how some of these irregular landscapes that are in use today have very early origins. So in not all instances do we see the landscapes being wiped away.
Just a quick addition to that, we certainly know on some Roman military sites that when the particular unit left, they just leveled the site flat themselves. That's quite well recorded. Perhaps the best known is in Tushel in Scotland, where they even gathered up all the nails. That's quite well recorded.
In fact, I mean, just my excavations at Kelstow, I've cut across the fort defensive, I think three or four times now, and the backfill of the ditches is the rampart material. It's basically pure clay infill, very little cultural material in them at all. Contrary to that, however, kind of going back to those larger enclosure circuits that seem to be thrown up around the site, that ditch at Cowstock is completely infilled with an accumulation over time of domestic rubbish from the bottom to the top, implying that it was being infilled during the active life of the fort. And the associated rampart was denuded post the infilling, which to me again reflects may sort of suggest the fact that these were quick features that were dug for an urgent need, which then went. The need was no longer there, and these big enclosure circuits get filled in with rubbish.
Incredibly, we've just got somebody wanting to get in. I'll let them in, at least they'll get a few questions. From Mark Willingdale, are there any long distance alignments emerging with the traces of the road that might suggest long-term planning? Certainly not that I've spotted.
No, I mean, the straightest section is that kind of running northwest of Exeter straight across to North Taunton. But I suspect that survives particularly well because for a large proportion of its length, it passes through landscape which wasn't enclosed until the post-medieval period. So it's an area where there's late parliamentary enclosures. So I think it essentially was the best straight sections were preserved in areas where they're not then manipulated or altered or integrated within the historic route network. So it appears as a dead straight road because it essentially is fossilized as such. Whereas if you're starting to, if routes are consistently used, over the next 1500 years and are adapted, I think they're going to start to look a little bit more wiggly. The section that cuts across the Quantoct is another one of those examples where it's clearly not fossilized within the later network. It completely is disregarded by anything later. And I think, again, that would argue for the case of it perhaps didn't last very long.
I'm going to jump forward because there's a related question here from David Breer. West of the Tamar, the roads look wiggly rather than the longer, straight, strategic roads we see in the Midlands and the North.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect that actually, if you were to, I mean, we've mapped actual traces. I think the generic road maps that we see published are very much straight lines drawn at a certain scale. I should imagine if you actually to draw the evidence bases in real terms, you would actually start to see that these roads wiggle. They have to go around certain elements of terrain, etc. So it could just be, I think, also a degree of how my maps are produced.
I think one of the reasons, David, certainly in Cornwall and Western Devon, is the topography. The road that we both spotted, Chris, northeast from Lostwithiel, it picks its way around the heads of the many small and very steep-sided valleys. It has to. It's got no choice,
and that's the same with all of the other roads as well.
Yeah. Right, just go back to the previous list from Bill. What was the nature of the threat that occasioned the construction of the forts in Cornwall? I think you've covered that largely. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the construction of the forts themselves, it was just the same part of the process of colonization, conquering. It's simply pushing to the limits of what became Britannia. I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't actually expect military sites into the far west, as we do in Wales and then in the northern frontier as well.
From Angela Spencer, about the method of investigation. Is the method transferable? And she's referring to the LiDAR, I'm assuming, for other organisations to carry out similar exercises, please?
Yeah, I mean, we have done things a little bit ad hoc because of the nature of how it sort of evolved. We didn't have the resources to have web interfaces built. Most of the community type archaeology projects that involve big scale LiDAR have been involved with Heritage Fund landscape partnership projects for discrete areas, so Snowdonia, various national parks or AOMBs. And they often have a very well built web portal where volunteers log on, there's training materials, etc. We had to react in a very different way. So we simply use Google Earth as a free tool in which volunteers can view data which we provide to them. Now, we're in the process of wrapping up our project and writing a toolkit which will give a step-by-step guide on how to not only obtain but process the data that's available from the DEFRA portal to then put that into Google Earth and use it yourself. Now, that can be done at any scale over any sort of area, bearing in mind, however, that we have Joao, who's processed our data, has very high-powered computers that can batch process big areas.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's very straightforward, and frankly, it's all free. So no, it's a way that I think anybody can start to explore this data. But I would really push for Google Earth Pro being a very useful means of viewing LiDAR data, because it enables you to look at satellite imagery and the landscape beneath it at the same time.
Yes. You can actually, we haven't time to tell people how to do it, but you can actually use the pre-processed LiDAR data from DEFRA in conjunction with Google Earth Pro. Some of the processing isn't brilliant, I have to say, but you can do that. Yeah. If anybody wants to know how to do it, contact me and I'll explain by email. Okay, moving on quickly, because we've still got quite a lot to get through. Sorry about this, Chris. You could be here sometime.
That's all right.
From another Angela, regarding human remains. I think she means datable. She says, are date appropriate human remains? I am assuming datable human remains. Have any been discovered near the Roman sites you've worked on?
No, simply because the soils in the southwest completely obliterate human bone. There are some military period cremation vessels from the Exeter area, and so there's small amounts of cremated bone surviving. But other than that, very little evidence at all. But it also could be because, frankly, we haven't really had the occasion to look in the hinterlands of nearly all of the military sites. And all of the known forts, for example, are at best sample excavated by evaluation trenching. Cowstock, I think, by the time my work is finished, will represent probably the largest area of excavation within an auxiliary fort in quite a large part of southern Britain, simply because we've had research funds to pursue open area excavations. So no is the answer to that. There aren't really any at all.
From David Breer again. There are so far no roads in the South Hams. Lots of past data though. Portable antiquity scheme.
Yeah.
Do you expect roads there?
Yeah. I mean, so Sherford is heading down into the kind of what I think of as the South Hams. I would imagine that any road must have run somewhere between, I guess, South Brent area and then up towards the Totnes and Teignmouth. We have excavated a very nicely made section of road that runs through a pre-existing prehistoric settlement near Newton Abbot at Ipplepen. Has a foundation date. It's clearly a piece of military construction. It's got an amphora handle pressed into the foundation layer. It's as if it's a bit of a road improvement scheme brought about by sort of the official governance. And other than that, there aren't any known sections despite us looking, but I would imagine that the wealth of sites that we can see evidenced by both crop marks and earthworks, as well as the PS evidence, would suggest that there must be a network of routes connecting these places to that broader road network. Yeah, just not really finding it at the moment. Although I have to say, well, you won't recall, but one of my earliest slides showed the progress of our project, and actually it's the South Hams data that we've yet to really finish looking at, because it was the last sets of data to come on board. So
next one, this actually relates to a talk we had last year from Delwyn Matthews. The National Trust at Kilton near Exeter have been investigating a possible fort/marching camp sited about midway between the main Legionary base and another fort at Colompton. Could this have been an early stage marching camp, maybe pre-Exeter base, do you think? LiDAR also shows a probable road.
Yeah.
He's obviously not watched the talk that we've had, but I'll let you answer that.
Hello, Darwin. Nice to know you're online. Darwin had worked with me at Cowstock. Yeah, Killerton site. It's an unusual one. It isn't constructed in the same way as I'd expect an auxiliary fort. Yes, in plan it looks like an auxiliary fort. There is some debate over whether it is permanent or temporary. The ceramic assemblage looks correct for a permanent site, and indeed the range of ceramics you wouldn't expect to be there present in a temporary marching camp. So I suspect it is a permanent base of some form, and you are right that it sits very close to a road that's going up from north of Exeter, Stoke Hill, up towards Colompton. And it seems to be an intermediary staging post between Exeter, Colompton, etc. Unfortunately for the wider audience, I know Martin Papworth gave a lecture on it last year. It was due to feature, I think, on this series of Digging for Britain, and it has been completely lost from that program. So it won't reach the general public, which is a bit of a shame. But no, whether it is something that is a truly permanent site, that one is a different matter, because I say it's a triple ditched enclosure. It's in that regard different to the other permanent auxiliary forts. So it would be useful to see some further investigation of its interior. The magnetic survey that was undertaken by Martin, I don't think really produced much in the way of convincing evidence for barrack blocks, the Principia, etc. So the verdict is still a little bit open on its true character, although there are signs of it being military.
Yeah, you don't always get evidence of the barrack blocks. So we did a geophysical survey of the fort at Rowcliffe, North Yorkshire, and there was virtually no internal features at all. Not that relate to the fort, if a fort it was. So you certainly don't always see them. Outside, however, the Vickers showed as clear as a bell.
Really?
So very strange. Yeah. From Sue Stallybrass. Hi, Sue. Not spoken for ages. Do the long-term reoccupied military sites, especially the fortlets, indicate refortification in the later Roman period in response to threats of coastal disruptions. When she mentions the Saxon shore forts and extra fortress and refortifications on the Irish Sea.
I think the point you make is absolutely right. We assume that our military period ends, and that's where it stops. You know, it comes 80, 85, and the Second Augusta move on, the auxiliary units follow after. But actually, there is the potential for some of these smaller fortlets, sites that have not had any investigation at all, to actually be, you know, of a later date. And actually, the enclosure, certainly around Bury Barton, for example, there is a distinct from, I mean, Malcolm Todd's excavations were limited, but there is a definite break, or there's a break in the chronology there from the late 1st century until the 3rd century. So, and then very late 3rd century. Is that a real break? Does one develop from the other? And I think there is a strong case for actually investigating many of these fortlets with some sample excavation to actually understand their date, because it's all very well mapping things based on morphology, but it doesn't really help us understand whether our military period is solely confined to the 1st century.
Slightly related, David Breer again. You talk about early Roman material as being military. Since this is an area where we know the population have been trading with Gaul for centuries, could these be sides of trade rather than the army? Yeah,
I mean, that's a fair point. I would say, however, that the majority of certainly Republican era coins come from sites that we know are, you know, have then an official form. So they are forts or sort of, I suggest, some of the more urban character sites. The Claudian coins are, I think, unlikely. They are largely unworn. There's a particular coin hoard from a place called Roborough on the southwest side of Dartmoor, where the coins are really basically unworn, and they're deposited. It's thought that they're deposited soon after conquest. So I suspect that they do represent military pay. But certainly there's no reason why some of this early material couldn't actually be entering the region through pre-existing trade. And I think the fact that the army moved so quickly into the west of Britain, we're reliant on the well-dated evidence from Charthouse on Mendip, where they're extracting lead and silver, you know, within a few years of conquest, if that, they're operating. So it suggests that they're not moving in and opening new industries. They're kind of linking into things that are already existing and known, I suggest, which means that there is obvious links for traded material.
Yeah. From Viv, Steve and Carol, I think the Steve is probably Steve Stocker, but I'm not sure. Any news on the dating of the ceramic piece from the road surface at Rowden near North Taunton?
No, it's a very specific question. Our fine specialist Naomi has got the material and is due to report on it, Steve. I will let you know. You'll be the first to know, Steve, I promise you.
Okay. From Tim. Here's a good one. Are the Roman milestones in Cornwall helpful in tracking roads?
Not in the slightest, because most of them are out of context and have been relocated.
If indeed they're even milestones.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So
one of the issues with them.
Fortunately, not.
I'm with you on that. Chris Ullman.
Yeah, good question, Chris.
Is there any prospect of using AI with the LiDAR, Carcassonne.net, to predict, or vegetation surveys to further track the road network where the human eye can't detect patterns that do exist?
Yeah, I'm sure there is, and colleagues, so Joao and another colleague, Exeter, Joanna, are working on AI with LiDAR data with some other scholars from the Netherlands, I think, and it has promise. I don't know whether they've looked at vegetation-based marks. However, it takes an awful lot of data to feed into these predictive modeling, particularly AI, to actually get results that are meaningful. We have actually used the initial data set collected by our volunteers, the 135 sites, to test an AI model. And to be honest with you, it didn't come up with the best results of finding things. However, the other thing that we've been working on with a colleague from Santiago de Compostela is using local least cost path and predictive modeling to actually corroborate our own findings, but also to suggest where we may find other sections of road. So I think there's more promise in using predictive modeling based on GIS than I do AI at the moment.
Yes, I would agree with you there. There's a couple of people who have been working on that in this country, and the names have gone right out of my head. Both PhD students.
Yeah.
I will remember, no doubt, when we've signed off. Right, we still haven't finished, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
Where are we? At least another 5. I hope you weren't expecting an early night. From Mark, are the later Romano-British sites useful as proxies? Thinking about military sites adapting into towns, which you talked about.
I think this is the route that we need to go down now, is kind of revisiting what we already have. I have to say the enclosures around these sites are unusual, and I can't think of many other large enclosed sites that we would think of as being civilian era. That we could then wonder, are they developing from military sites? The only other big enclosed sites you can think of are generally thought to be Iron Age and Hilltop. So that's a difficult one, but I do think we should consider all of the data now from everything that is dated to the Roman period, and actually try and ascertain a hierarchy of the settlement pattern, to understand, you know, what places may have served which roles. I mean, for example, there's a number of places that are unenclosed but have rich material culture, and spread over a wide area, that you would think are important sort of waymarks, roadside settlements, may even have functioned as mansio in the civilian network. So I think we need to pull together, or it's needed to pull together all of that information. Unfortunately, most of the information that we need is actually buried within HERs and is unpublished. So sometimes it's quite difficult to actually access that, you know, meaningfully without exhaustive HER searches. So no, I think you're absolutely right. We need to look at the later sites and think, well, what are their origins?
This is an interesting one from Martin Doherty. If roads were used to transport ore, might this show up on large-scale soil chemistry data from spillages? BGS, I'm not sure what that stands for, have mapped soil chemistry, question mark.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid idea.
Oh, British Geological Survey.
British Geological Survey. They work with Campbell School of Mines and for the Southwest. So we have a scheme called the TELUS. I think it was in the early to mid 2000s,
yes,
and large scale soil chemistry, and also magnetic data, I think, is collected. So yes, it would be worth us now actually looking to see, are there any sort of telltale signatures within their broad scale data that links with the roads. Whether or not you'd expect sufficient quantities of ore to be regularly spilled along a road to kind of then transfer into a signature 2,000 years later, I'm not so sure.
The answer to that is yes, actually. There's a very interesting paper which was published some time ago in English, but not in this country, which I've been trying to get permission to reproduce in Itinera, from, desperately trying to remember where, it's either Netherlands or Germany, where they established exactly that. During a road excavation, they sampled either side. They were suspecting the road had been used to move lead ore, and they sampled either side, and they'd proved it.
Fascinating.
Quite substantially so, from isotope analysis.
But presumably that's from on-site sampling versus broad-scale sampling.
Yes, it was. Yes, so there is a difference in that. Dev Armstrong's just come to my rescue. He's got the names I'd completely forgotten. That's Graham Erskine and Joe Lewis. Sorry, guys, if either of you are actually watching. From Peter Webb, is there any evidence of tree and undergrowth clearance either side of Roman military roads? I think he's meaning generally rather than specifically in the southwest. Would this not be likely given a potentially hostile population?
I think the answer to that is probably yes. There's two things there. Yes, you would expect a corridor to be cleared through which a road, but it presupposes that there's actually significant woodland cover through the areas which the roads pass. Large scale sort of pollen analyses aren't really available for the southwest. There's not that many well dated sequences, so it's hard to really build a vegetation history, if you will, of the first century. And this is a thought your question is just provoked, is how many of the quarry pits alongside the roads that we see as earthworks may be sort of tree hollows where trees have been removed and then infill? Just a wild speculation. I suspect not many, if any, but it's just I wonder if that is a possibility, that some of the disturbance we see along in the corridors of roads actually isn't deliberate quarrying. Could it be the removal of vegetation?
That's possible. I never thought of that.
I think that's a really good question. I'd
certainly see it. What feeds into this? There's a common misconception, which an unfortunate one, which we come across quite a lot. The idea that throughout the country, Roman roads have ditches immediately either side of the Agar. And whilst that's usually true in upland areas, it's certainly not when you get into lowland areas, where you tend to you do have ditches, but they're offset a substantial distance from the road. You see many archaeological reports or excavations where they don't find any ditches, and they come up with some very fanciful ideas as to why the ditches aren't there, when the usual explanation is the trench wasn't long enough. It's as simple as that. We're finding a very common distance of around about 60 pedes, Roman feet, separation for ditches in lowland areas. So it's defining a sort of a road zone. This sort of feeds into Peter's question. How it applies in the southwest, I really don't know. It's interesting that actually a couple of researchers in Spain and in Portugal as well have identified a series of roads where the ditch spacing is 120 feet or more. So substantial road zones. The reason for that, we can only speculate. It could be a defensive one. Maybe perhaps it was an area that no one was allowed to be in. There are a whole stack of reasons why that could be the case. From Andy Downey, what does the absence of roads heading up to North Devon mean for the coastal fortlets at Martinhoe and Old Borough? Were they as isolated as they seem?
I think probably not. There is I think suggestions in the LiDAR. I haven't included it because I'm not 100% confident. I think there's more than likely roads heading up towards certainly Old Borough across Exmoor. The problem is when determining routes and roads across Exmoor is that there are so many that have been used over so many centuries that it's really difficult to kind of be confident in saying that this is likely to be Roman. But I think there are some that connect well enough to suggest that they were connected. I'm sure that the sheer number of sites and the occupation that we're seeing in the Tor Valley, for example, means there must be a road logically connecting something on the south side of Exmoor straight across towards Barnstaple. The topography itself, suggests it. There is one place where you can follow a parish boundary and hedgerow across the landscape for about 5 miles in an almost dead straight line, and it's clearly of an early origin. It's not post-medieval, and I suspect that there are fragments there that would connect up if we had more evidence or more confidence in them. So no, I don't think it was that those northern signal stations were in fact cut off. I just don't think we yet have the evidence.
And I think this is the final question from Anthony. Both Dave and I think this is Anthony Durham. Good evening, Anthony. South Hams area has several interesting Roman place names looking for a home. For example, Salcombe, Kinsbridge area is a good suspect for Masona and Alavergium. It's a comment on the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? I've not really gone too far getting into sticking labels onto places. It's a dangerous one to go down. There are some clear examples. The best one being North Taunton, Albury, Barton, the cluster of Nimit place names derived from Nemeton. I think there's as good a chance as any that and Nemetastasio is somewhere in that area, and I'd say it's North Taunton. So no, I think you're right. It's worthwhile revisiting some of these documented places and actually seeing now whether our archaeological evidence can actually start to fit them.
Yeah.
You know, it was once fashionable, then not fashionable. So why not? You know, we've got so much new archaeological evidence.
Right, I'll just double check. If there's anything else, Dave, can you send it through now? Nope, nothing. Right, that appears to be it. What time are we? Goodness, 9:15. So all it remains for me to do is to thank Chris, but also to thank tonight's audience. We've had a substantial number of people, over 200. And for the, as usual, intelligent and wide-ranging range of questions at the end, which as always as interesting and compelling as the talk itself, although it was fantastic. And I suspect we're going to be asking for you to talk to us again in the future about more of the work that you do that's ongoing, Chris. It's absolutely fascinating stuff.
Good, and I mean it's all very preliminary results. There's
Yes.
you know, as with everything, more questions than answers. But
yes, well, there certainly are. But the impact of what's been learned over the last few years on understanding of the early Roman period in the southwest really just tells us how much we don't understand, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not even beginning to get a grasp of it. What's one thing I would like to mention myself is the sheer number of similar sized temporary camps that you're turning up. That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Are they all tending to be around the 10 hectares size that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, so the Legion camps are generally 10 to 15 hectares, and then at the lower end, they generally are sort of between 2 and 4 hectares. There's you know, there's two distinct clusters. We don't have enough evidence to really kind of be, I don't think, kind of constructing the same sort of arguments you get for the sort of Scottish lowlands about kind of disposition of troops. But I maintain that given the short chronology of our military period as we believe it exists, and the relative proximity in 2 instances of those legionary scale camps, to me it suggests that they're of 2 different phases, or more than one phase. It's not just a straightforward march west, conquer, move back to Exeter. I think there's something else happening.
Yeah, I think I saw a question actually that didn't. There's been so many questions. I think Dave might have missed one. I just glanced at something on the chat earlier. I completely forgotten about it, which I think was asking about the spacing of temporary camps and as to whether there was any pattern or regularity to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think we have enough data with the camps at present, but certainly it appears that the permanent auxiliary forts seem to be regularly spaced. And I mean, the best example of this, you know, of kind of in the period of time that I've been working in the southwest, is that Restormal and Cowstock were identified or discovered within a year of each other. And someone then identified a group of material. It's clearly an assemblage of military glass and ceramics from a site above, they were digging a well, I think, or improving a spring head. It sits exactly halfway between the 2 forts in the right position for another topographically. So, you know, and it is literally exactly halfway. So I think, you know, I think there's almost no doubt that there is a military site where this collection of material at Menheniot is. So yeah, I think they are regularly spaced as much as topography will allow.
Just had a comment come in from Tony. West Penwith. Oh, it's gone. Hang on, let me open the chat up. West Penwith may yet provide a surprise or two. And thanking you again for the work. Your efforts may prove as valuable as Agricola for future archaeologists.
I'm not sure I get that far. But yeah, I think West Penwith is, there's a reason, whether it is some of it is traded, all the material that's being discovered and reported to the PS, yes, much of that could be traded, but I'm sure that there is an official presence there. There is some sort of, you know, true Roman presence that we're just not understanding.
Okay, I'm just...
Tacitus ignored us.
Yes,
very good.
You've seen it. Right, I think we'd better call it a day. So thank you very much again, Chris. An absolutely fascinating and thoroughly informative talk with a heck of a lot more to come in future.